So recently, Avatar Frontiers of Pandora launched on PC and console, and I've been playing it, and my god, is this game just incredible. It's so much more than just like a Far Cry clone or like a copy of the movies or whatever. It's basically an Avatar RPG. I might end up actually making a review of this game down the road, so subscribe if you guys want to see that. Let me know in the comments down below as well. But today what I want to do is I actually want to benchmark this game on PC, but not just benchmark it. What we're actually going to do is we're going to use the secret Unobtanium settings for the game. So we're going to do one from before with the normal default settings and one after with the Unobtanium settings. According to the developers, the Unobtanium settings basically just go above and beyond what you would normally be able to push the game to do with the regular max settings. So certain things like water reflections or maybe texture quality, shadows, lighting, different things like that might be slightly higher, and you should see a slight impact to your performance because of it. But let's go ahead and actually see how this game performs. So as you can see here, these are the ultra settings. We have everything, which is pretty much the max you would normally be able to get. These are the default normal settings. But if we go up top here, we actually can go one more to the right and we get Unobtanium right here, which goes even further beyond to where now everything says max, not just ultra or high, but max is now your new option for some of these like reflections. You now have even higher settings to use with the Unobtanium settings. And the way that you get the Unobtanium, by the way, I will put the code in the description down below and on screen here. You put this code on your screen right now inside of the launch command in the Ubisoft window. And it actually is worth noting that this game does use ray tracing for things like reflections and the shadows, and I believe the lighting as well is all ray traced. And the upscaler that we are using is FSR 3. They don't actually have DLSS 3 or 3.5 in the game, so the frame generation that you can use is the fluid motion frames from FSR 3. I truly hope they add in DLSS 3 or 3.5 into this game later with a patch, because that would be amazing. FSR 3 and all of that stuff is great, don't get me wrong, especially in this game. It's the best version of FSR 3 frame gen that we've seen, but it's still not as good as DLSS 3, at least in my opinion. So the first test we're going to do is on Ultra, which is the normal highest mode you can have. We're going to apply those settings and then run the benchmark, and I will see you guys in just a second. Alright, so we are now in the benchmark, and we have the Riva tuner numbers in the top right-hand corner, and we have the regular benchmark stats right there as well in the purple boxes. So you can really see all of the numbers with a frame time graph. There's the CPU running at about 23%. We are definitely CPU limited, though, in this game. As great as the frame rate might actually be, we are definitely CPU limited. And if we go to the next area here, let's see what we get for frame rate and everything. This game is very impressive for how much detail it has. The lighting being ray traced and everything like that. The shadows, and I think the reflections are all ray traced as well, I believe. And you can see we are still getting a bit of a CPU bottleneck. So if I had a faster CPU, we'd be getting even more frame rate. And this is with the FSR 3 frame gen on, so take that with a grain of salt. We can turn that off for a future benchmark. And here we have, during some weather effects and everything, we're getting about 150 FPS. Granted, this is without the Unobtanium settings as well. This is just the regular ultra settings that you could get. And honestly, we're getting some crazy good frame rates here, hitting almost 200 with frame gen on, and we're CPU bottlenecked as well. So that frame gen is really coming in handy during this benchmark here. So here's our total stats and everything after that benchmark, and you can see we averaged about 190 frames per second in the benchmark. That's with frame gen on, at 1080p, with ultra settings. So now let's go ahead and test those Unobtanium settings with the same everything else that we just had, same resolution, same settings, just turning it up to the Unobtanium, and let's see what happens. Alright, so we're back in the benchmark now with the Unobtanium settings at 1080p, with the FSR 3 turned on, with frame generation turned on. And you can see just how much those new Unobtanium settings really impact your performance here. I'm not sure why the numbers up there in the Riva tuner numbers aren't changed. Oh, now they are. Okay, they were just stuck at 97 or 96 for a while. But you can see we're actually less CPU limited now. Overall, we're using less of our CPU than before. We were at like 20-something%, and now we're at like, what, 12 to 15% CPU? So we're definitely using more of our GPU, which is good. And we took a big hit on that frame rate, a pretty big hit indeed, but we're still getting about 120 FPS in some of these areas, or in that last area, I think we averaged like 80, I think is what it was. So this game is very beefy depending on the hardware that you have. And because the game is running ray tracing for its lighting and shadows, and I think reflections as well, like I said, it definitely can be pretty beefy on certain pieces of hardware, especially if you don't have good ray tracing capabilities. So if you're on like a 3060, I would not run this game at ultra. I would run it at like high settings, because the way that the ray tracing is in this game, it's actually built into the ultra settings. So you're going to get the ray tracing no matter what if you're on the highest settings. Alright, so now you can see here, once we turned on the Unobtanium settings, we went from about 190 average to 117 average. So those new Unobtanium settings definitely take a hit on your performance. We used a lot less CPU and a lot more GPU, but we're still CPU bottlenecked. Our average GPU usage was 51%. So I still think no matter how you slice it, the 4090 is going to be CPU bottlenecked at 1080p. So let's go ahead and change over to 1440p and try this again and see what that GPU usage goes up to as well. Alright, so we are back. We are going to run the game at 1440p here, and we have the settings back to Ultra so we can see what the Ultra and Unobtanium look like at 1440p. Alright, I will see you guys in the benchmark. Let's do this. Alright, so here we are inside the benchmark, and we're using the Ultra graphics, so it's not the Unobtanium highest of maxest settings, but you can still see that we are using about 75% of our GPU and 20 to 22% of our CPU. So it is going to use a good chunk of CPU in this game, because the game, once again, is made by Massive, so they are definitely known for the Division's CPU bottleneck. And in this area here, as we fly over this huge valley and this huge canyon with these cool rock shapes and everything, so we're getting about 150 FPS, 144, somewhere in that range, which is really good to see. And I am honestly super shocked that you can get about 144 FPS on the ultra settings in this game at 1440p with the frame gen on. That means if you had a 1440p 140 Hz monitor, you would be able to fully utilize that. And even down here in the nitty-gritty jungle with all the rain and stuff going on, all these particles and everything, we're still getting upwards of 140 FPS. I think once it's loading in stuff like that, you might drop to like 115 or something, but you can see we're still doing just fine. It's using about 20 gigabytes of RAM because that's just what games do nowadays. I'm not surprised by that at all. And the VRAM is locked at like 12 to 13 gigabytes, which is pretty good. Alright, so with the Ultra settings at 1440p, we dropped down to 145 FPS. So at 1080p Ultra settings, we were at like 190, I think is what it was, and now we're at 145. So definitely a very solid frame rate to get here with the 4090. So nothing really to complain about there. 145 FPS with a minimum of 106 and a maximum of 173. So that's actually pretty good. So now let's go ahead and test out those Unobtanium settings. Alright, so now we have the numbers back in the top right hand corner, as well as the default numbers in the benchmark there, and not looking too bad. Not looking too bad. It is a little bit lower on the frame rates because we are more GPU centered now instead of CPU bottlenecked, but it's not looking too bad at all, honestly. It's still really smooth. The frame time graph isn't completely smooth, as you can see there. There's a little bit of fluctuation, but you don't really feel that very much. Even in this area, the frame time isn't completely smoothed out, which is a bit unfortunate, but again, in actual gameplay, you don't really notice it. And you can see that we are actually... So I guess that graph in the purple graph there in the middle and the light blue, that's not accurate GPU percentage, because you can see in the Riva numbers up there, we're actually using like 80 to 90% of our GPU. So we're still getting a little bit of CPU bottleneck there, but we can reach up in the 90s. We are still using about 20 gigabytes of RAM, which is pretty standard nowadays. That's not making me cringe or anything, because that's pretty standard nowadays, and we're still getting about 90-ish to 100 FPS in the demo or the benchmark here, so that's really good. It looks really smooth. This game is gorgeous, and there is just a possibility that the game is just, it's CPU bottlenecked like the Division was, because it is made by Massive. So here we are at the Unobtanium settings at 1440p, and our new average is 88, which is still a pretty good frame rate to have, but it does make me worry a little bit about 4K. Alright, so now let's go ahead and do a quick 4K test and see what happens, and then we might jump into some random gameplay out in the world. Alright, now we are back in 4K. So we are still running the game with FSR 3 and everything on, and with the frame gen as well. We are running the game on the ultra graphic settings, so we'll do that first, and then we'll jump over to the Unobtanium after that. So let's go ahead and do the benchmark. Alright, so we're inside the benchmark now at 4K with FSR 3 turned on and with the frame generation on as well. And we're getting 80 FPS still in this area. We're already using about 16 gigabytes of VRAM and 18 gigabytes of RAM, but we are using actually in the high 80s to low 90s for our GPU finally. We're finally seeing that GPU be put to work, but we're still using like in the high teens for our CPU though, which is kind of crazy. So as you can see there, the frame time graph isn't a flat line. It's not exactly perfect, but I can tell you that from experience, the game is very smooth. It looks incredible here, and there's only a little bit of pop in, like the world and the engine is incredible. They've done a very fantastic job with this game, and at 4K, you can see all of the detail. It is incredible here. Using about 90% of our GPU at 100 FPS with a small spike there. Loading these different areas is super fast too. You can see we're still getting about 90 FPS here, 85 to 90 FPS, using 19 gigabytes of RAM, 14, almost 15 gigabytes of our VRAM, and still 90% of our GPU. So I think this game is just definitely CPU limited. We're not fully utilizing that GPU at like 95% or 99% or whatever. So here at the ultra settings at 4K, our new average is 91 FPS there. So that means that we went from about 190 FPS at 1080p ultra settings to 90 FPS at 4K ultra settings as well. And you can see we're still using about 10 to 15% in that range of our CPU. Okay, so now we're going to run the Unobtanium settings at 4K and see what our FPS drops down to. I'm betting about 60 FPS here is the average. Okay, so we're back in the benchmark here, and you can really see we're now using 99% of our GPU. Our VRAM is slowly climbing up there. As you can see, it's going from like 18.5, 18.9. We're at 19 gigabytes of VRAM there. Like, our VRAM is slowly climbing. Thankfully, we have a 4090, and we're getting about 50 FPS here, so definitely a GPU bottleneck there. So honestly, with just the VRAM it's trying to use, you really cannot use this on anything that does not have like 20-something gigabytes of VRAM here, because it wants to use like 18 to 19, almost 20 gigabytes of VRAM at times. Even when I was playing this on stream, I noticed my VRAM at like 22 or something gigabytes of VRAM, or 19 or whatever it was. Like, this game definitely loves your GPU at 4K with those Unobtanium settings. The Unobtanium settings shift the entire performance like bias towards your GPU and away from the CPU. So you can see here we're getting about 50 FPS, which probably is going to be the average at 4K, which 50 FPS isn't bad, but considering we have the frame gen on there, that's actually not the best, because without it, I don't know what we would get. So at the Unobtanium settings at 4K, we didn't even average 60 FPS. We got about 52 FPS. So really, those Unobtanium settings are very GPU heavy. I'm legitimately curious what our frames would drop down to if we didn't have the frame gen helping us there. I'm worried it's going to be like 25 to 30 FPS, but let's go ahead and see, I guess. Okay, so back in the benchmark here without frame generation on at 4K on the Unobtanium settings, and I was right. 25 to 30 FPS, fully GPU limited here at 99% GPU usage, and like the same, 10 to 15% CPU usage, and that frame rate is not good. So realistically, this is not the best frame rate to have, getting about 25 to 30 FPS at 4K without frame generation on. So if you want to turn it on, it'll save you and you'll get about 50 to 60 FPS in the game at 4K with these Unobtanium settings on. But if you are not a fan of frame generation, you are definitely going to have a pretty bad time playing this, I would say. Sub 30 FPS is not what I want at all. I'd wager that most of you don't even want to get 30 FPS in a game anymore, let alone sub 30 FPS, so definitely could use a little bit of work on at least the CPU and GPU optimization for the game, but overall, the 1080p and 1440p numbers not on the Unobtanium settings. I feel like Unobtanium is definitely removed from the game for a reason. They're very taxing settings. So at the Unobtanium settings at 4K without frame generation on, we hit an average of 28 FPS there with a minimum of 22 and a maximum of 34. So I can definitely understand why these Unobtanium settings are not natively in the game, because hardware just cannot really run them at the higher resolutions right now. They're probably not super optimized. So again, it may not be super fair to compare the Unobtanium settings without frame generation on, because that's just, it's not in the game. It's not the native way some people would play the game. So to be completely fair, let's switch the graphics down to ultra and see what our frame rate goes up to without frame generation on as well. All right, so we're back in the benchmark here, and we are definitely still GPU limited, even at the ultra settings here. 98% GPU. Although we are using way more of our CPU now, we're using like in the 20% range, not just the 12% range. So we're using about 10% more CPU there, which is kind of impressive. And we basically almost doubled our frame rate. So at least from these little views here, it seems like, yeah, you can get 4K 60 FPS, well, probably an average of 60 FPS at 4K without running Unobtanium settings, so I can see why they weren't in the game. I can see why you have to like actually add them in yourself if you really want that, and you can't really judge them for the performance of it because it's just not the real performance. So judging these 4K numbers here without frame generation on, with everything at ultra, not Unobtanium settings, the normal like maximum settings you'd have in the game, I'd say it's actually pretty decent. Like the frame time graph is pretty smooth, no major spikes or stutters or load times or shader compilations, and we're hitting about 55 to 60 FPS, like that's good. So yeah, at the ultra settings at 4K, we were just shy of that 60 FPS range right there. We were 56. But these numbers here, almost getting 60 FPS without frame generation on at the ultra settings. Like if you don't like frame generation technology, you don't want those fake frames, you can still get 60 FPS at the normal ultra settings. If you add in those Unobtanium settings, it's gonna hurt. But you can't exactly hate them for it, because that's why they're not in the game, I'm pretty sure. They're just unoptimized right now. They just make the game look a little bit extra pretty, but they subtract so much performance. Alright, so we're actually in the game right now, and I just wanted to see what actual gameplay would run like. So we're inside of one of the major cities, be it in the beginning of the game here. Nothing really spoilery at all, but lots of AI, lots of cool decorations running around, and this is with the game at 4K settings with the frame generation back on and the Unobtanium settings here. So this is like actual gameplay of what it would look like to run it at Unobtanium settings, and it is running about 50-ish FPS, but let's go ahead and see what happens when we go outside. So just outside of that area in the main jungle here, and it is honestly beautiful. As you can see, this game is ridiculous. This engine, the Snowdrop engine, does not get enough credit for how beautiful it actually is. I've always thought it was really gorgeous with Division 1 and 2, and even some of the Ghost Recon games they've put out have been just insane. The foliage density they have here rivals the best of the best with games like Crysis. And they have just ridiculous lighting on all of the foliage and good physics on everything, and it just looks amazing. This game is ridiculously pretty. And like I mentioned, the game does feature ray tracing when you go on the like very high to ultra settings for like shadows and reflections and things like that. It has the ray tracing built in. There's no dedicated tab or dedicated ray tracing buttons or settings that you can adjust. It's either you go all the way ultra with ray tracing, or you go like medium settings and you don't have ray tracing. So I do think we should be taking that into account for this game as well, that because the frame rate is lower, it's not exactly unoptimized, it's just ray traced. And look at the gorgeousness of this game though. Like, it is ray traced and beautiful, so like you can't really fault it. So looking at just the VRAM there, if you don't have 24 gigabytes of VRAM on a 4090, you are going to struggle to play this game. And this is with the ultra settings as well. Like, it's not Unobtanium. The ultra settings use this much VRAM at almost 21 gigabytes of VRAM. And the RAM is also 20 gigabytes too. So if you're on like a 3060 with like 16 gigabytes of RAM and you're expecting to run this game at 4K 144 Hertz, you are going to be lying to yourself, because it's not only ray traced, but the texture quality on every single thing and all the ground detail and all the clutter is ridiculous. This is a fully next-gen, fully modern game with the graphics to prove it. I wouldn't even want to test it on my 3080, honestly, because it only had 10 gigabytes of VRAM, so it would be absolutely horrible. I don't think this game is fully unoptimized. I think it's a next-gen game, and I think there's a lot of next-gen features with it and a lot of like the graphics to prove it, with just the intense ground detail that you can see here, and it is just incredible. Insanely good lighting, extremely dense foliage. It's a next-gen game with next-gen graphics, and you need next-gen hardware to run it. It is that simple. We've been seeing a lot of those games nowadays that do that, and people still want to complain because their 3070s can't run freaking Lords of the Fallen, which is a ray-traced game with Lumen. They can't run it at ultra settings at 4K, and it's like, yeah, no duh. I mean, just look at this freaking game. Like, it's a next-gen game with next-gen visuals that needs next-gen hardware to run it. So I am very happy with this game. Let me know what you guys think of the game and its engine and the performance in the comments down below. Honestly, in its own way, they did an insanely good job at packing this game full of detail, and they should feel proud. So hats off to Massive for their incredible work on this game, making it look just redonkulous and making it honestly run pretty darn good. So be sure to let me know your thoughts about this game in the comments down below. I am seriously blown away by this game's visuals and the performance of the game, given the actual technology they've crammed inside of this game with the dense, incredible detail of everything around you. Like, it is amazing. And I actually am going through a playthrough of this game on my Twitch side as well, so if you guys want to go ahead and follow me over there on my Twitch channel, I will leave a link to that in the description down below. And you guys can come watch me play through this game and just kind of get all immersed and do all the outposts and all the fun stuff like that. So let me know what you guys think in the comments down below of the performance of the game, of the graphics of the game. Are you guys enjoying it? Are you guys a big fan of Avatar? Let me know all of your thoughts in the comments down below. So once again, thank you so much for watching, guys. I greatly appreciate you guys hanging out with me today and watching the video all the way through like you have. You guys are freaking awesome. If this is the last video I make before the holiday times, then happy holidays and Merry Christmas to you all. I hope you guys have a fantastic weekend and fantastic holiday time with all of your friends and family. You guys are awesome. Thank you so much. And be sure to give this video a like if you guys enjoyed it, if it helped you out, kind of giving you the insight into the performance numbers that you can get with the RTX 4090 on Avatar Frontiers of Pandora. And subscribe if you guys are new here, and I will see you guys in the next video. Thank you so much for watching. Have a good one. Happy holidays. You guys are awesome. Later, nerds.